I can be in a team.
I'm not putting a tag on that. No.
Why are you whispering? Neil, you need to talk louder.
No, why are you, what is this? What's happening?
You're like prairie warbler whisper singing over there.
Is this any better?
Yes.
Thank you. Not sure why it does that sometimes. No, Steve, I would want to, I wouldn't want to be trying to put a tag on a bird by myself with Daryl there to take notes.
Okay, well then then we're gonna leave Dylan by herself.
No, I thought all of us would go to the same spot and set up multiple nets in that one
Oh,
spot.
okay. I thought we were gonna break into 2 teams and try different ends.
No, I think we should try and gang up on them with multiple nets, and if we get one, move and try and get the other.
Okay. Yeah, that's true. Daryl wouldn't be of much help helping you get the thing on.
Let me see how we had for registration tonight.
Wendy said there were 6.
Oh, okay.
Those participants then include us.
Yes.
So we got 5.
Here we go, 525. Amanda Doucette, Liz Ricci, Scott Stoner, Shannon, Rebecca, and Kim.
Where are you seeing this?
In my Special Magic registration page.
I can just look at the attendees and their participants.
Oh, you are so.
Yeah, so we've got Kim, Amanda, Liz, and Scott and Denise.
Just see us and Wendy. Oh, attendees 5.
Well, they should start posting questions if they have them, right? While we're waiting.
Forgot to pre-register Susan.
There's over 9 people in your party.
Oh, hi, Rebecca. Hi, Ezra. Susan says she knows somebody else who is planning to attend but forgot to pre-register. Susan, you can share your participation link with them if you want. Registration is probably closed now because it's technically started. But this is kind of informal, you know, it's not like you're missing something if you log in late. So if you wanted to share your participation link with them, they can log in. Wendy, I forgot to ask, did you get any questions on the live stream last time? Or is that nobody can submit questions?
Nobody can submit questions that way.
Okay, all right.
And we're all set whenever you want.
All right. I'm not Susan, I'm Kim, but it's Susan who's planning to join. Oh, and you did send her the link. Okay, thank you, Kim. Scott, yes, Scott, yeah, I do have those open. All right, so I guess we'll get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our second Nerds of a Feather chat. So you are here tonight with some Pine Bush nerds who are looking forward to answering your questions or discussing anything that you are curious about talking about tonight. My name is Amanda Dillon. I am the field ecologist and entomologist with the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. Neil, you want to go?
Sure. My name is Neil Gifford. I'm the conservation director at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve.
And I'm Steve Campbell. I'm the conservation biologist at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve.
So we 3 make up the conservation science department. So we're here tonight to answer any questions that you may have. You can put them into the chat box or into the Q&A. I also at the top of the chat box posted the link to the form site if you wanted to submit a question that way, or if you had any photos. I'll also type my email address into there so you can email me directly.
We're gonna get some activity in the chat.
Yes, yeah. So Scott did submit. I'll share my screen real quick to share Scott's photos. Scott shared some photos from the burn on the 25th. Hang on, I had them open. Where'd they go? Didn't I have them open? Oh, it opened them when it, okay, all right, fine.
On the 24th,
Um,
today's the 25th.
Yeah, let me do, sorry, let me
Yeah,
check.
there's that.
From May 24th. Yeah, sorry. So these are his photos that he took. And I think he tells us maybe from view of the May 24th prescribed burn from the shoulder of Rapp Road and also from Cook Park. So here's his first picture. So this looks like we're taking it maybe from 6 Mile, looking at the burn.
Yeah. That's great. Nice shot, Scott.
And this is the one from the trailhead.
Beautiful. Look at that.
And then this is the one from Cook Park.
Great. Scott, those are great shots. And not only because they're good images, but I like that the smoke is going straight up. It's not drifting at eye level toward anybody that might be sensitive to smoke, but it's well up and away, well over the tops of the trees.
So thank you so much for sharing those, Scott.
Looks like you had a question associated with his images based on the chat.
He was checking to see if the images came through. So yes, they did come through. We got them. Oh, he was wondering how the burn went. So Neil, do you want to talk about the burn over there
Happy
and
to.
what we were
Happy to.
trying to do and how it went?
Yeah, so the burn went really very well. Tyler Briggs, our fire manager, along with a crew of other seasonal and permanent staff, volunteers, and New York State Forest Rangers, ended up actually burning 4 different management units down on the peninsula of Rensselaer Lake. Ultimately, the Rapp Barrens, right near the intersection of Interstate 87 and 90. So it's one of those areas in the preserve that is exceptionally difficult to burn because it really, the window of opportunity based on wind speed, direction, relative humidity is really quite narrow. So because Tyler had the opportunity, he took it. Burned 4 management units there. All 4 burns were part of what we consider the restoration phase of ecosystem restoration, trying to expand the area of high quality pitch pine scrub oak barrens that we have in the preserve. The preserve it's a work in progress. So it's now, we've protected 3,350 acres toward an ultimate goal of a little over 5,300. But part of that is also not just building and adding land to the preserve, but restoring high quality barrens to the areas that are protected, which is a tall order, particularly down there. So we had done a number of mechanical pre-treatments to prepare the site for fire, thinning the overstory a little bit, opening it up so things would dry well, get more wind at the ground level. And Tyler took advantage of those conditions he had yesterday and was able to put in a really effective and successful prescribed fire or controlled burn. The 2 terms are synonymous. In particular, the reason it was successful, not only because the fire stayed where it needed to stay and the smoke behaved very, very well, but also that, as fire managers, what we're really trying to manage are fire effects. So we're more fire effects managers. And the fire that he had yesterday was very successful at not only eliminating some of the competing understory vegetation, but also getting rid of some of the litter and accumulated organic matter on the forest floor that has accumulated over the course of like 50 years of a lack of fire down there. Eventually, that site will probably require a few more burns before we expose enough mineral soil where we can plant lupin, like what's behind Dylan and I on our backgrounds here, and continue to expand the carnival butterfly habitat. But overall, the fires Tyler did yesterday with the crew, a little over 50 acres, very successful, both from the perspective of a safe fire, but also in meeting ecological objectives and in reducing hazardous fuel loads. The thing about the pine barrens is they're going to burn. Fire in these systems is as inevitable as sunshine and rain. It's going to happen. So by using these periodic controlled burns, we keep the amount of burnable material reduced. So if and when a wildfire does happen, and we've had numerous over the course of my 20 some odd years in the preserve, when they occur in places where we've done prescribed fire, the fire is much more manageable and much easier to put out. Mother Nature doesn't tend to burn under the moderate conditions. Mother Nature tends to burn under extreme conditions. So it's really important in the landscape that the preserve is in to manage it periodically with fire and keep those fuels from building up so that we continue to not only provide for the rare ecology, but also provide for public safety.
Kind of related to that, Neil, Liz asked if all the burns at the preserve are the same, meaning are they
Oh.
targeting different things if you do it in the spring versus the fall?
Every prescribed fire is different. They're kind of like fingerprints. The conditions are never exactly the same and the fire effects are different. And for the preserve is divided up into 70 management units, and each management unit has a specific prescription or a permit approved for it with specific objectives. So ultimately, yeah, we're trying to restore pitch pine scrub oak barrens, but they are different. And in particular, we've crossed the threshold this time of year, which is why it was great to get fire on the ground yesterday at that site, because things are greening up. And so we used to do a lot of our prescribed fires in the dormant season, and we still do prescribed fire in the dormant season. So early spring, before things green up, but physiologically, the plants, all their energy in the roots. So that those dormant season fires are great at maintaining high quality pitch pine scrub oak barrens. But if we're really trying to restore something that's degraded back to high quality habitat, hitting it when things are leafing out, the vegetation is a little more vulnerable, and we're actually able to get a slightly hotter fire that burns more slowly, and it will stress because the plants have used some of their root reserves. We end up having a slightly different impact. And in this case, we wanted that. We're stressing out the competing vegetation for the grasses and wildflowers like lupin that we want, and eliminating the litter and duff. By burning when things are green, think about it, live foliage is mostly by volume water. And if you've ever tried to boil a pot of water, the old expression, right, a watch pot never boils. It takes a tremendous amount of time and energy to evaporate all that water in order for, and you have to evaporate all that water for the fire to advance. So you end up with a hot, slow moving fire that has tremendous ecological benefits that you simply can't get in the dormant season when the vegetation is asleep and nothing is green. That's a great picture, the side by side there. Thank you, Steve, or Dylan, whoever pulled that up.
This
So
also
you can see
shows the,
here. Yep, you want to talk about the graph?
oh, no, go ahead. I was just pointing out what you're saying about the timing of over the years, that shift from growing to dormant to growing.
So there's a bunch on this slide. Thank you, Steve, for pulling this up. So pictorially on the left, at least to my left, we have a dormant season maintenance fire and high quality pitch pine scrub oak barrens, basically in the fall or early spring before things green up. And then you have a similar site in the growing season. You can see everything is green, and that's kind of like what it looked like yesterday for Tyler and the crew, and very different restoration outcomes and very different fire effects from those two, from burning at different times of the year. You can also get different effects from increasing or decreasing the frequency with which we go back to a given site. The problem with relying solely on dormant season fire in the pine bush, the preserve is so fragmented with roads and development that it's really not, it's not as reliable. The conditions aren't as reliable to be able to go back to any given site and hit it on a repeated schedule with certainty. So by expanding the window, burning in the growing season, we're actually able to meet our objectives another way. But you can burn more frequently and get some similar outcomes. But when you're, I liken dormant season fire in the restoration phase, and we're trying to get rid of all of that accumulated litter and duff, 3, 4, 5, 6 inches of it. It's kind of like peeling an onion in the dormant season. Those dormant season fires, it's like peeling an onion one layer at a time. If you've ever looked at an onion under a microscope, right, it's all those thin layers. So each dormant season fire, it only scratches the surface because everything is dry. So the fire just races across the top, the surface. It doesn't burn down through the stuff. In the growing season, again, because you have to evaporate all that water, the fire moves. The fire moves a lot slower and has a bigger effect. No, oh, great question. Can I follow up on Liz's question? You see
Yeah,
that pop
sure.
up,
So
Dylan?
then Liz said Neil said a bit ago about planting lupin after a burn. Does it naturally grow after a burn, or do you literally spread seed for native plants?
Yeah, that's a
It's not a
fantastic
silly question, Liz. There's no silly questions.
No, just silly answers. I can do that, but that's a different show. So yeah, the lupin fire was kept out of these systems for so long that the lupin seed bank was exhausted or dead. So when we go in and we do these restoration treatments, there is no lupin left to naturally spread into these sites. When I first started here, when Wendy and I started back in, well, a while ago, there were 9 sites that contained lupin that totaled about 13 acres. And those 9 sites supported Karner blues and frosted elfins. So no, we didn't have enough lupin left in the preserve as we restored to naturally populate the places we burned. So we follow up after fire by seeding lupin. So the area behind Dillon, that's a management unit called Draperies, and that was seeded after a growing season fire. And the area behind me, this is and Dillon's Draperies is in Madison Avenue Pinelands. And the management unit behind me is a growing right at the day after a growing season fire in the Truax Trail Barrens, and that management unit is called the Andromeda. And both of those sites, we have it's much like a planter that farmers use to plant corn, but it's a no-till seed drill that Joel and Jesse tow behind the tractor, and it cuts a little tiny furrow into the soil after a burn and disperses the lupin seeds. And using that method, yeah, there's the tractor and the seed drill. So using that machine, we're able to actually, with very little disturbance to the site, planting lupin at 3 pounds of live seed per acre, end up with sites that look like the backgrounds that Dylan and I have behind us. But now, of course, managing and maintaining those sites with fire, lupin persists and spreads. The other thing that we need in order to get lupin to successfully establish is getting rid of that litter and dust, that organic matter that accumulates. And that's true for many of the plants that are unique to the pine bush. Pitch pine, New Jersey tea, wild blue lupin. In order for those plants to successfully seed, they really need contact with the sand. They don't compete well and don't grow well if they just fall on top of that accumulated organic matter. So fire is one of the critical roles of fire is preparing the seed bed for these native plants and then creating conditions that allow them to really do well when they're developing seedlings, as they're young plants. So we've seeded now, we're up to over 700 acres of lupin in the preserve. Again, we started with about 13 acres of lupin in the early 90s.
I can show that map if you want.
Sure. Today we have over 700 acres, and that's a combination of doing what I just talked about, following fire in high quality barrens. So on this map, thank you, Steve, the greenish blue teal shading here are all areas where we've seeded lupin. If it's a former locust site, black locust being a non-native invasive plant, we're seeding a whole host of native seeds from native plants, all of which originate from within the preserve or from within 50 miles of the preserve, so that we're really working with local genotypes. But and it worked amazingly well, so well, in fact, that we actually we started accelerating the colonization of all of this habitat by Karners, which is how today, well, in 2020, we had, releasing butterflies into, man, you are good. Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. You can see the dots here show the different years where we released Karner blue butterflies that we reared in captivity. So no breeding in captivity, simply catching first brood females and holding them in a lab with the New Hampshire Department of Fish and Game. Those females produce eggs that are reared to pupa that you see in the Petri dishes there. We get those pupa back, and then they would eclose at the Discovery Center, and as they come out each day, here's Dylan carrying butterflies in those little butterfly tents out to restore habitat, effectively jump-starting the colonization of new sites. Each of these sites, we only released butterflies in a single year, and then left them on their own and started monitoring those sites a year later. All of those sites took successfully. In addition, you can see how those dots are distributed across the preserve. There's actually, all those dots are distributed across the preserve. So we effectively seeded every section of the preserve with butterflies. All those sites persisted. And as we continued to add and restore more habitat in the preserve, the butterflies are colonizing that new habitat by themselves. And our best example of that, on that map that you see on the slide Steve has up, there's a green polygon on the far right down by Rensselaer Lake or in the Wrap Barrens. Butterflies colonize that patch. You're right, Steve? Yep. Butterflies colonize that patch of lupin by themselves from that nearest green dot that you see just to the northwest. And that's because the population grew to the point. And that's what we're seeing now with, tens of thousands of butterflies in the preserve. They are dispersing and successfully colonizing as much habitat as we restore on the landscape. It's really something to see. And I don't know about Wendy, but I had hoped one day that this would be the case in the Pine Bush. I didn't fully expect to see it at this scale during my tenure. It's really been amazing to see the transformation of the preserve in the last 20 some odd years. And the full recovery of the Corner Blue here, at least here in our local population.
All right. Kim presents an interesting ethical dilemma. So Kim says, I figured out that a small caterpillar I took to rear from a non-protected area, thinking it might be a mourning cloak, was actually gypsy moth. Ethical debate currently raging on whether it is wrong to rear a gypsy moth.
It's not wrong, depending, I don't know, I guess I'd say it's not wrong depending on what you end up doing with that adult moth. If it's a female, I would hope she doesn't make her way back into the wild.
Yeah, so I mean, this is an interesting theory. I mean, the whole idea of invasive species is, I find, super fascinating, because the concept of an invasive species really has a lot to do with a time scale thing, and the impact that it has kind of on a very short term basis. So these are novel animals that are introduced into areas where they don't have a natural check on their populations. And so the gypsy moth is introduced from Europe. It was actually introduced, I just looked it up, it was introduced in the late 1800s. So it's been here for quite some time. I believe that's a species now that's probably considered more or less naturalized. And it does reach kind of pandemic proportions, where it can be a pest of northeastern forests, but most of the time it subsists at low enough levels that it's not really much of a threat anymore. But this idea of like managing invasive species is a really interesting one, because lots of times we do more damage trying to manage the invasive species than we do trying to, than we do if we had just left it alone. So for example, we introduced a fly into North America to control gypsy moth populations. And this was a fly that we knew was a predator, parasitizes the caterpillars, and we knew it kept its populations in check, or we suspected it did in its native range. So we introduced this caterpillar. We didn't realize that we introduced this fly. We did not know that this fly was going to parasitize all of our native species as well. So that fly is kind of blamed for decline of many of our native species as well, including a lot of our giant silk moths. So
you talk about the mismatch, Dylan, in the biology of not only that fly, but some other biocontrols for gypsy moth, that whereas gypsy moth only has one brood a year, those introduced predators or competitors are problematic.
Oh, I don't know about those.
Yeah, so the tacated fly has 5 generations a year, but the gypsy moth only has 1. So in order for it to persist, it has to have a bunch of other hosts. So it feeds on, it's a generalist that feeds on lots and lots of moths, not just gypsy moths. And there has been a ridiculous number of biocontrol agents released since the 1800s to try and manage gypsy moths that have consequently eliminated or dramatically reduced a whole host of native moths and butterflies.
Yeah, and Wendy just pointed out, good. I'm saying I mean like scientists in North America. The Albany Pine Bush Preserve Commission did not release the fly to control gypsy moth. We didn't do it. But well-meaning scientists and biologists in North America did. So yeah, and of course it's not that individual's fault. We have labeled gypsy moth as an invasive species. We've labeled them a threat to native species. But you know, they don't know that, right? They're just doing their thing. They're like, this is great. We're doing super well here. We got here. There's nothing eating us. There's tons of stuff for us to eat. So for us to kind of label these animals as bad and villains in some way and enemies in some way is really a very anthropogenic way to look at it. I don't know, Steve, do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, I mean, it's just from perspective from our native wildlife. It's harming the wildlife that are here, and these things occur. These things have a native range somewhere else, and so in that sense, I think it's usually not too hard for people to get on the side against the invasives because of the harm they do to native ecosystems. But yeah, they're just doing their thing. It's our fault for bringing them here, but
gypsy moths do alter the plant ecosystems as well with the level of deforestation that they've had historically. In particular, less so up here, but more so in the Mid-Atlantic, in particular, in the Appalachians, where they've really like denuded whole landscapes of oak forests and altered all kinds of ecosystem dynamics. So there's a massive cascade effect of some of these introduced species like gypsy moths on whole ecosystems. So it is a judgment call, and it is an ethical dilemma. And I don't know what you do with one individual. Is one individual female gypsy moth?
No.
If it's a female.
Yeah, I mean,
End
so
up-
long story short, Kim, you probably can raise that fine. You're not going to cause the decline of northeastern forests with your
there goes
one
a pine bush. Thanks.
Yeah, I doubt they're out there. I mean, it very well could have survived and made it on its own without your assistance. So I don't
to be a
think you
big
need
year
to feel particularly bad in either direction.
Seems to be a big year for gypsy moths in the Adirondacks this year, based on what I've been seeing from colleagues in Plattsburgh.
I mean, I would add in general to the invasive species talk. Like you said, it's a judgment call for us to call them invasive, but there are some scientists who sort of embrace it and say this is all just going to be the new normal in the anthropogenic era that we've created, and we'll just like basically everything's going to go everywhere, and we'll let Darwin sort it out and figure out what we're going to be left with. And there's certainly some scientists that push that. I think we kind of hedge our bets against that a little bit, because you're going to probably lose a whole host of species while that is sort of settling out. And so
The larger biodiversity side of that, given that it's human caused, it's not natural per se, it's human induced.
It's not always. Who's to say
No.
whether or not gypsy moth could have made it over here on their own?
They might have someday, yes, but it's also the rate of change is the problem. It's not so much that the individual species is the problem, but the rate of change, because we've moved species around the globe, is really reshuffling whole ecosystems and threatening an awful lot of not only individual species like Karner blues, but also whole ecosystems like pine bush.
But also to Dylan's point, though, sometimes we've changed the climate and things are just moving north with the climate. They're just doing with their thing and adapting, moving with the climate that they're adapted to. And so do we fight against that, or do we accept that as a logical consequence of our changing climate?
Right, and how much? Yeah, where do you?
That's a good question.
It is, yeah. And this idea of like, how much resources do you spend trying to eradicate a species rather than embracing the novel ecosystem that's created?
But it is somewhat different than the case of the southern pine beetle, which is a native insect whose range is expanding in the face of climate change and causing big problems for overstocked pitch pine forests to our south on Long Island and northern New Jersey.
Yeah, the problem there maybe isn't the southern pine beetles. It's that the lack of fire has made the pitch pine too dense, and the pitch pine can now not as effectively defend themselves from an attack of. So the beetle is able to reach like a huge population size that is actually able to impact the pitch pines.
And gypsy moths too. It's somewhat a symptom of a greater ecosystem health issue than a single individual species causing an impact issue. And we've in many ecosystems, especially those that depend on fire, we've dramatically altered the natural processes that would have maintained ecosystem health and ecosystem dynamics for millennia. You know, the pine bush is at least 6,600 years old, best we can tell based on pollen and charcoal cores from the preserve. So you're looking at these systems that have lived in stasis more or less with natural disturbance regimes of fire for thousands and thousands of years. Now, in the course of just a couple hundred years, we've dramatically altered the processes and the distribution of plants and animals. So it's not surprising that we're seeing whole ecosystems fall apart and change as a result of all of this stuff we've done in the landscape.
All right, I'm gonna bring it back to, so Steve, I wonder if you want to talk about, so Scott and Denise asked if we were gonna burn any more in the Truax Trail Barrens because they noticed that we had a site that is mowed over there. So do you want to talk about why we mowed that site in the Truax Barrens?
I mean, I'm not sure when it's on the docket to be burned. We mowed that, this was a winter mow that we just did, right? So it's not, so when it's mowed, it's typically on the docket too, assuming we don't have a COVID year and can actually burn. The mowing is just sort of a preparation for the site to get some of those effects that Neil was talking about. We put it puts the fuel on the ground, it cures and it helps it burn and reduce that litter and duff layer because it keeps the fuel on the ground. And then especially when we do that during the growing season, as I think Neil said earlier, then, and again, I'm still learning all this fire ecology myself, but as a fire moves and is burning that fuel that we've put on the ground, it evaporates the water out of the vegetation, the green vegetation before it can burn. And then as a result, that heat stays on the ground longer and burns more into that litter and duff that gets us there. It's all about exposing the mineral soil because that's what a lot of these native pine barrens plants want to germinate in. They're not going to germinate on these layers of litter and duff. That's going to be more favorable for non-pine barren species that have a sort of a richer base. The pine barrens, especially the pitch pines and the lupin, of course, are going to go right into the sand. And so the mowing is in part for preparation. We can, not to get sidetracked, but we are looking at it as a possible way to manage for carners as a way to sort of temporarily boost the numbers. We saw this last year because we didn't follow these mows up with a burn, that we mowed some areas and we think it was also a combination with good weather, but some of these populations exploded at some of these sites. And so moving forward, we may consider using mowing as a potential tool to sort of give a temporary increase to the carner numbers, especially where these sites are isolated, right? If they're isolated and we burn them, we could possibly, if not wipe out, certainly set back the population at those isolated sites. And then it's going to take a long time for sort of carners from outside areas to move their way in. But if we want to try to bump the numbers in those sites, then maybe a mowing is a way, because mowing basically doesn't kill any of the carners, where burning probably kills a pretty good substantial, depending on the, tell me if I get this right, depending on the severity of the burn. Severity is the effects, right?
Right. Yep. Intensity is physical attributes of the fire itself, flame length, how fast it moves.
Right. So if the effects are severe, it could wipe out the carners. If we turn everything to ash.
It seems like it's kind of our adaptive management strategy. So part of our adaptive management is a lot of the more detailed science that we're collecting almost as experiments in parts of the preserve for various management treatments. But in this case, it's more of a look and see. We noticed that following the mowing, the lupin seam in particular did exceptionally well. And then we had phenomenal weather and the butterfly population did well. So we're wondering if mowing these sites, letting the lupin and butterflies boom that year immediately following the mow will set them up at higher population levels to be able to better recover when we burn it the following year. So Scott, to answer your question, most of those, there are a number of sites that we mowed this winter. There are a couple in the Truax Barrens. There are, I think, 3 in Carner Barrens East. Those sites are slated to be burned next summer, so a year from now, basically. Ideally, we'll hit it in late May, early June when lupin is blooming like it is behind Dylan and I, because the lupin is actually so succulent, it doesn't burn. So these growing season burns on the maintenance phase can be really mild. and patchy, like what's behind that picture behind me. And you end up with all of those patches that didn't burn end up being refugia for carners. Carners are an enigma to me. I love their biology, their ecology, because no life stage of Carner blues can survive fire, but it only lives in places that burn real frequently. Pine barrens and oak savannas, where the fire frequency of any given spot is anywhere from 5 to 10 years. So the way, if you think about it over time and over those thousands of years, Carner blues were in this incredible dance. I liken it to a dance in this with fire across the landscape. Fire burns patches of lupin, all the Carners die. Lupin comes back better than ever. Butterflies that survived in unburned patches colonize that lupin that comes up after the fire that burned and do even better. We've done experiments to see that Carner larvae that are fed lupin from a burn site actually lay more eggs. Their fitness goes up. So it's just, you can imagine just this shifting mosaic on the landscape of fire and Carners and lupin hopscotching across the landscape over time, persisting in the landscape, not because individuals necessarily can survive fire, but because they're playing a game of hopscotch around the landscape following fire.
Can I interject one more point about Truex Trail barrens?
Yeah.
We wouldn't necessarily burn those units all together because that would really potentially wipe out the Carners in that area. So we have I don't know, is it a policy or are we forced to this
It's
by
a
U.S.
rule,
Fish and
'cause
Wildlife Service?
it's interstate and federal permit. So the 1/3 rule, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we can only burn 1/3 of an area. So we wouldn't want to burn those neighboring units in Truex Trail barrens because then those Carners would have no place to go. So the idea is we burn one section. When that regenerates, then we can burn another section and those Carners will basically have somewhere to go, basically to act as a refuge to recolonize those areas after we burn. So we wouldn't burn those neighboring units until the unit that we burn has recovered some.
So we designed that rule with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the New York State DEC. So we won't burn more than 1/3 of a subpopulation in a given year. We cannot burn adjacent thirds in consecutive years to ensure that there's adequate refugia and adequate time for the butterflies to recolonize the lupin that comes up after fire. Lupin's a long-lived perennial. Butterflies as an adults only live 3 to 5 days in the wild. So the lupin comes back, grows right, it's a perennial, so it grows back after fire, and then the butterflies find it and carry on.
All right. Ezra, you said every year we have this bug that goes inside the monarch chrysalis and kills the new butterfly inside. What bug is this? So Ezra, I need some more information. I'm curious, is the bug attacking it from the outside of the chrysalis? So is it something that's chewing into the chrysalis or stabbing into the chrysalis? Or is this something that's hatching out of the chrysalis before the butterfly hatches out? So there's a lot of things that will attack. Basically a chrysalis is like a little sausage, right? They can't move around. That's why they try to camouflage themselves or why they try to hide themselves somewhere. So because they're a sausage. And so lots of things want to eat that. Okay, he says it hatches out. So my guess, Ezra, is that this is some kind of, there are a few different wasp species and fly species that will actually lay their eggs inside of the caterpillar. And so the caterpillar will go through all of the motions of eating its host plant and going into its chrysalis, thinking everything's hunky-dory. In the meantime, it has this parasite, so this larval wasp or this larval fly inside of it that is eating it from the inside out. And so sometimes this happens when it's still a caterpillar. They will hatch out of the living caterpillar. And sometimes they'll wait until they make their chrysalis. And then that animal actually goes into a chrysalis inside of the caterpillar or inside of the caterpillar's chrysalis. And then that will hatch out first. And so it's usually some kind of wasp. There are a lot of parasitic wasps out there that do that, and also some fly species.
It's like a sci-fi horror movie.
I'm pretty sure the movie Alien was like loosely based on these types of insects. Because you're alive and you think everything's hunky-dory, but you're being eaten from the inside out.
I think it was directly based on that biology.
I think so too, right? Am I crazy that I think
I think they use that for inspiration, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is why it hits so hard.
Yeah.
Happens in the real life.
Let's see. Oh, hi, John. So John says, are there any negative or positive impacts from COVID that have happened in the preserve in the past year? I
A
guess
lot
I
more
would
people visiting
say,
the preserve.
yeah, that's what I was gonna say is we had a lot more visitation in the preserve. Which is, I mean, that's great, right? That's what one of the things we're tasked with to do with our mission is to provide recreation opportunities for people. So it's good from that point of view. Maybe it's a little less awesome if you had a little secluded part of the preserve that you like to visit and all of a sudden everybody's there. We did see much higher visitation at many of our trails than we usually do.
Biologically, I can't think of any significant differences that I noticed.
Well, if you're into spurious correlations, Carners do better in COVID years.
The sample size of one.
For some reason, the Carner population exploded this year, and we're a little bit of a loss to explain what happened. We think it was a combination of management and weather, but our population went from somewhere around like in the vicinity of 12 to 15,000 for the last 4 or 5 years to jumped up to 46,000 in the areas that we survey. And it was
But Steve, you teach conservation biology. Can you talk a little bit about, the explosive nature of insect populations and why and how that can occur?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of we like to categorize things as ecologists, and so we try to make sense of the world, and so we categorize things into things that are known as R selected and K selected species. R is the ecological mathematical symbol for population growth. So populations grow as R. K has to do with carrying capacity, and so it's sort of organisms that are selected for rapid population growth versus organisms that are selected for sort of staying at the carrying capacity. And Carner blues are these R-selected species, and some of their characteristics are is that they have lots of young. They don't buffer well against environmental fluctuations, and they don't provide any parental care or anything. So their idea is like just put out as many eggs as possible, and when conditions are good, populations will explode. If they put a bunch of eggs out and they don't do well, or only a small portion of them do well, then that's sort of how it goes. That's sort of their bet hedging strategy is just to throw out a bunch of eggs, where you have things like K-selected, like an elephant would be a good example of a K-selected.
Classic example.
Yeah, so they take a long, and also the development time tends to be longer for K-selected than R-selected. So the K-selected species, they tend to gestate for a long time. They give birth to large young, and then they take care of those young. They provide a lot of parental investment, and then those individuals tend to have very high survival rates. And so those are like sort of the elephants are sort of on one spectrum, and then you have things like salmon and insects that are on the R-selected, where they're called big, they're just mass reproducing. They just have lots and lots of eggs, and they basically they're rolling the probability dice and saying some percentage of them will survive. When conditions are very good, you may have a lot of them survive, which is probably what happened this past year in terms of the Carner blues. They can lay up to hundreds of eggs. And so if you can imagine if the 15,000 Carners we have lay hundreds of eggs and all those eggs survive, the potential for the population to explode is very, very high, and it could go up if conditions are good. Now, we are not necessarily celebrating our 46,000 butterflies this year because the R-selected species can just as easily go the other way. If you have bad conditions, like I said, the butterflies can't buffer against, they don't produce their own heat, they can't maintain their own warmth. So if you get a bad frost or something, or bad rain, like their population can plummet just as quickly as it goes up. So with our selected species, you're going to see a lot of this up and down, where the K-selected, right? If elephants or something or deer have a bad year, their populations aren't necessarily going to plummet unless it's really, really extreme, because they have fat reserves. They can sort of buffer against some of these environmental extremes, and their populations don't go up and down with the environment as much as these R-selected species.
So just to follow up on that. So we think what happened is that, right, like as I mentioned earlier, we've gone from 13 acres of lupin in the landscape in the preserve to 700 acres. So we've set the table, created favorable conditions, and then we had favorable food reserves and habitat. And then the weather kicked in and the population grew. But Steve, can you talk a little bit about climate change and thermal limits and exceeding a species range of variability, because the problem with our selected species being receptive to changes in weather and climate is that they have the potential for dramatic declines. We got really lucky actually in Albany, I think, because we were able to keep the carnivores here long enough to see the population grow, but climate change could undo all of that.
I mean, I can show that one map that shows where the range is expected to go.
You have the graphics of the warming winters.
For here locally?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is data from the Albany Airport. And so here's average daily maximum temperature, and this goes back to 1940. And so we're seeing any p-values that are less than 0.05 are considered significantly increasing or decreasing. So we're seeing our maximum temperatures in the spring and winter increase. Fall and summer don't look like they're increasing. And then what's really interesting is our minimum temperature. So the ceilings is going up maybe a little bit, but what's happening is our floor is really coming up. So our minimum temperatures are increasing across all seasons. So we're not getting nearly as cool as we typically do. And that has obviously important implications, especially in the winter for things like snowpack, which protect the carnivores. But that daily snow isn't really a thing. And we are seeing you could look at this, significantly increasing precipitation in the summer as a positive, but I think what comes with that is we're going to see, yes, we might see heavier rains and maybe an increase overall, but we're going to see periods of drought followed by deluges, and we're going to see a lot more variability and in the precipitation patterns, which is going to become a problem. If you have like a period of drought followed by a deluge, that's not going to necessarily be well for them. It's going to necessarily like a constant
Can you show that climate map?
Contribution of rain. So there's so people out west, so this isn't necessarily the newest research, but this is showing where this is the current sort of thermal tolerance range of the Karner blue in this upper one here. And
in the model to show where, so they built a model.
Yeah, I don't have the details for the model, but what they do is they take the locations of where the carnivores occur, and they link those conditions to the carnivore populations to those conditions, and then they sort of create a model saying this is within the thermal range of this species. So here it is. Yeah, current distributions described by relating these occurrences at these sites to bioclimatic variables. So this is stuff like temperature, rainfall, snow depth, all of these different things they throw into this model. And then they take the projected climate change scenarios and they project it forward. And so this is where they expect the thermal tolerance of this species to be in 2080. And you can see it's pretty much gone everywhere except for, you're going to test my geography here. That's northern Wisconsin. Otherwise, it's heading into Canada for pretty much the entire species. And so we're down here in the pine bush. And so we're, according to these models, by 2080, we're not going to be within the thermal tolerance of the species.
That's a potential.
Yes.
Part of the issue with the butterfly populations and their ability to crash is it doesn't take many days that exceed their thermal limits, either cold in the winter or hot in the summer, where it's beyond what they're typically used to dealing with, and you can see populations crash. So we think about climate change happening relatively slowly, but some extreme events can have pretty extreme outcomes when those extreme events are beyond the tolerances of individual species.
And something usually Dylan points out is, which is a good point, is the topography in the preserve and how that might play out for climate change. I don't know if you can talk about that, Dylan, so I don't have to.
Well, I do want to reel us in a little bit.
Okay.
What was the question exactly?
Yeah, so the question was about the effects of COVID.
So Nerds of the Feather was a really good title.
Oh, we did get off topic.
Yeah, that spiraled pretty quick there. Yeah, back to effects of COVID. So increased preserve usage for sure. I will say that, that is good. And we want people out using the preserve and enjoying the preserve. We do hope that people who are using the preserve are following the rules. So things like not using illegal trails. So we did see a lot of, so we have split rail up a lot of times in the preserve, and that's because we're either closing down an old trail. And the reason that we're doing that is because the preserve is fragmented enough by roads and homes and businesses. So the pieces that we have left, we want to keep as continuous as possible. And it may not seem like you walking on a trail is fragmenting it much, but when a lot of people are doing that, it does affect animal behavior, and it affects the plants, it affects soil compaction. And so we do close down internal trails to try and keep nice big pieces. And sometimes it'll look like those are still trails because they are used as fire breaks when we're doing our prescribed burns. So if you ever come across a split rail and it looks like a trail beyond, you're right, it does look like a trail, but if it doesn't have the little colored trail markers on it, it is not a legal trail, and we would ask that you don't walk on that. Also, we have a lot of people that walk their dogs in the preserve, and again, great. You're totally allowed to do that. Your dogs should stay on a leash, both for the safety of other people walking on the trail and for the safety of your dog, because you're really more likely to pick up ticks if you're letting the dogs run out into the pine bush. And it's going to affect the experience of other hikers on the trail. Also, poop bags for your dogs. So if you don't have to take your poop out, it's better if you do, but you can just kick the poop off the trail. And we would prefer that happen rather than bagging the poop and then leaving it somewhere in the preserve, because
Well,
now
Or worse, bagging it and then
all the
throwing
time.
it into the preserve.
Bagging it and
Also
leaving it
happens.
on the side of the trail.
That's
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
double.
yeah. So,
You don't have staff to pick up trash in the preserve, really.
right.
But also with
yeah.
dogs off leash with wildlife, right? There's all this, it's a nature preserve. So all these crazy and complicated lives of wildlife where they're trying to carry on and do their thing. And that's a really unnecessary additional stress. And it influenced some of our research. We've had dogs off leash attack a bird and a miss net. That happened once, for real. And you never know where your dog may be perfectly well behaved in your yard and with you, but the consequences of him or her being off leash in the preserve can really be negative.
Yeah. So I guess, the most thing that we saw, we didn't see anything biologically from COVID that we are aware of. The biggest effect that we saw was increased usage of the preserve, which had both positive and negatives. Okay, to wrap it up tonight, I've seen like a few questions, and I think that we could, Kim says, also there are skunks in the preserve. You will be sorry if your dog meets one. That is true. There are skunks in the preserve.
Porcupines.
Yeah. Oh, and porcupines. Yeah, that you also don't want your dog to meet. Okay, so I've seen a few questions kind of like centered around like what are our ultimate goals. So for example, would we not burn an area or manage an area because there's something rare there that we want to maintain on the landscape? And I think that kind of gets to this bigger question of what is the ultimate goal of the commission? What is it that we're trying to do? And I think it was Susan's question kind of leading into that was, are we trying to turn it all into pine barrens, or, are there areas that will stay forested? So
I'm going to take that.
sure.
Great question, Susan. So, yeah, long story short, yes, all of the dry uplands in the preserve that we can restore to barrens, we want to do that. Not only because the barrens used to cover, at least 25,000 acres in this landscape. There's only 3,000 acres protected in the preserve. So part of the system's ability to persist in the long term is to make it as big as possible so it can support diverse populations of the rare wildlife and plants that depend on pine barrens and depend on fire. But there are lots of places like the ravines, like the wetlands, where we would not, be looking to restore those more mesic, those hydric sites to pine barrens. But if you look at some of the old historical photos, many of the ravines in the southeastern section of the preserve were wide open savannas, much like what's behind Dylan's head with the canopy structure. And barrens went down into and across many of those ravines. Ultimately, it's about balance. So pitch pine scrub oak barrens are globally rare, supporting a whole host of rare plant and animal species that really can't live in any other type of environment. Northeastern forests are actually more common today than they were 100 years ago, largely thanks to fire suppression and agricultural reversion. So, 100 years ago, there was a lot of agriculture that was abandoned when everyone moved to the Midwest and agriculture became focused out there. So as a consequence, we've seen a lot more forest growing up and maturing in New York and across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states as a result. And some of that, obviously that's phenomenal for forest plants and animals. But pine barrens, there are fewer than 20 known examples in the world. The pine bush is considered by most experts the best remaining example of this plant community. So for us to be able to ensure its long-term survival, we're going to try and maximize to the extent that we can how much barrens we can restore on this landscape.
Can you think of any instances, Neil, where we have where there's been a species that we didn't burn an area because we didn't want to wipe out a species?
Not recently. Well, there's two, I guess. So historically, we could not burn occupied Carner sites because we had too few of them. And we didn't have enough lupin on the landscape where the butterflies would be able to recover and persist. So we simply mowed those sites and kept invasives out mechanically and didn't burn them, which helped in the short term, but long term, that wouldn't work at the scale we're managing now. The other one is I think about the reptiles, in particular the turtles. So there are some concentrated populations of turtles where we really need to be cognizant of not burning too much of their habitat in any given year to make sure that we're not negatively affecting their populations, whereas Carners are kind of the R selected species that Steve talked about, producing lots and lots of young. Their strategy to see their genes persist in the long term, passed on from generation to generation, just have lots and lots of young. Turtles are more of a K species. They won't sexually, we're 2 days after World Turtle Day, and DEC has really done a great job of trying to raise awareness about nesting turtles this time of year in May and June. Most of the turtles you see on the landscape are females looking for nesting sites, but these animals don't reproduce until they're 5 to 20 years old, depending on the species, which means just even removing a few females from a population in a fragmented landscape like ours can have serious detrimental impacts on that population's ability to persist. So things like spotted turtles, we're cognizant about fire in some of those habitats, some of those sites. And there are examples now. We've lost reptiles over the last 50, 60 years as a result of that. Roads and fragmentation and roadkill in particular. The two of the biggest snakes that used to be really common in the preserve, black racers and black rat snakes, are completely extirpated, again, because they don't start reproducing, those females don't start reproducing until later in life. So when you start removing females as they're dispersing to try and nest on crossing roads, the population will crash. And in the case of both of those animals, DEC biologists are pretty sure that it's not only habitat loss, but fragmentation and roadkill that ultimately extirpated black racers and black rat snakes in the pine bush. And that's the kind of thing we don't want to see happen with spotted turtles. So we are cognizant of where they are and how much of those habitats do get burned.
Yeah, and I guess I can't think of a species that's so restricted. So because we can only burn 50 acres at a time, we're not impacting a big enough area to wipe out a species. Even if we had a species that had a restricted range in the pine bush, it's not to such an extent that we'd wipe it out with one of our burns. And when we're coming up with our burn plan, we're like, well, we do, like Steve was saying, we wouldn't burn all of the Truex trail barrens in 1 year. We put it on a cycle so that the populations have time to recover and move around.
But those are some of the long-term questions we have. Realize, folks, that there is no reference community for pine barrens, for high quality pitch pine scrub oak barrens. We're figuring this out as we go, and we don't know what the long-term fire regime needs to be to maintain the site. We think it's relatively frequent, low intensity and low severity fire, but there's no reference community. No place in the world can you go and look at and measure a pine barrens that supports robust populations of Karner blues, frosted elfins, whippoorwills, prairie warblers, brown thrashers, and golden wing warblers, and black races and black rat snakes. It doesn't exist. So we're looking at, we have a lot of good historical data on some of those wildlife and historical data on the fire regime, and thinking about the kinds of fire effects we want for all of those species. Like what condition would have facilitated all of those species persisting in high abundance and high distribution historically, and then trying to mimic that on the landscape by effectively, I think of ecological restoration as reverse engineering, looking at the effect you want and then evaluating the tools you have to try and get there, doing experiments on a small scale to see what works, and then slowly ramping it up to a larger scale and continuing to do the work that we three do with the monitoring, to see what those outcomes actually are, and then adapt our strategies over time. And that's how we've ended up getting, the preserve is not only bigger than it used to be, there's more pine barrens than there were 30 years ago when we started. Fire management started in 1991. So this is the 30th year of our prescribed fire program. There's more barrens in the preserve. There's higher quality barrens in the preserve. And we know that not only by looking at the plants and the plant structure, but also looking at the wildlife data. Wildlife are really our best surrogates for ecosystem function and ecosystem health, because in order for their populations to grow and persist, they have to meet all of their needs. They have to find wintering spots and nesting spots and enough food for young and all of that. So if the rarest wildlife that really depends on this habitat is doing well, their distribution and abundances are going up, we know we're on the right track. And that's why we three and our seasonal staff spend so much time monitoring the wildlife. One, it's to know and add to the body of science and body of conservation science, but ultimately it's helping the commission figure out what's working and what's not working, so we can really ensure that this habitat and this landscape persists in the long run. Are we going through the movies,
right.
Steve? Is that my
I
cue?
know Steve just changed. All right. Speaking of that, the three of us are actually going to do some science tonight. We are going to try and tag an eastern whippoorwill in the preserve with a GPS tag so we can figure out how they are utilizing the different habitats in the preserve. So I want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight. There were some good questions that we didn't get to, so I would encourage you to go ahead and submit those via the form site link that I put at the top of the chat, and we can start with those at our next Nerds of a Feather chat, which will be next Tuesday, same time, same place. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great night.